The appearance of a serial killer is always a high-profile event at police stations. Task forces are always on standby and detectives try to find the culprit day and night. But the case that Detective Gavin Graham has taken on requires a unique approach. Most serial killers are men. Physical strength, stamina, brutality, and cold-bloodedness play a considerable role. Often their crimes are sexually motivated. The methodology for finding these criminals has been honed to perfection. But what if the suspect is a woman? Gavin's had experience catching serial killers, but this is the first time he's come across one that is female. The detective went to the archives to look at similar cases. Of all the high-profile cases, Gavin singled out 10. He needed to get to the bottom of the crimes to find clues and finish the investigation successfully. The long days of work began. The first and oldest case on the list referred to Amelia Elizabeth Dyer. The elderly woman who worked as a nanny turned out to be an absolute monster. After taking hundreds of lives, she is considered the most bloodthirsty infant murderer in modern history. Amelia was born in Britain in 1836. After the death of her husband, the 38-year-old woman found herself needing work to support herself and her 2 children. After receiving a medical degree, she was able to turn to childcare and became a nanny for unwanted children. It is unknown exactly how the children in her care began to die. It is likely that Amelia did take care of the children at first, but failed to give them proper care. Either way, the increased death rate at the orphanage drew attention. The woman was sentenced to 6 months of hard labor. After that, she started killing the children on purpose. Dyer starved them, strangled them, or overdosed them with drugs. Then the perpetrator successfully disposed of the bodies. Amelia Dyer was repeatedly treated in psychiatric institutions and survived 1 serious suicide attempt. The woman had lost her mind. The hour of reckoning came when the body of a baby in a sack was discovered in the Thames. Evidence led the police to Dyer, and she was arrested on April 4, 1896. Amelia Dyer murdered children for 30 years, and no one could stop her. The exact number of victims has not been established. Researchers count more than 400 children. The criminal was sentenced to death and hanged on June 10, 1896. Reading this, Gavin couldn't believe that such a person could exist. Amelia became a ruthless monster due to mental illness, and the loss of her husband was the impetus behind it. The second woman on the list was Amy Archer Gilligan. Amy owned a nursing home and enjoyed the trust of the community. Everyone loved her so much that when the Connecticut State Attorney received a murder charge against her, he didn't even look into it. The sister wrote the complaint of one of the victims. Mr. Andrews lived at the Archer house and worked there in the garden. He was in good physical shape, and suddenly, in just 24 hours, his condition deteriorated catastrophically. The official cause of death? Gastric ulcer. But upon their investigation, the man's relatives noticed that while Amy was running the house, 48 guests had died. The inquiry didn't begin until after a newspaper article appeared interviewing the accusers. The investigation lasted a year. It turned out that she had poisoned Andrews and 5 others with arsenic, and before they died, all those killed had given Amy a large sum of money. But it was impossible to prove her involvement with the other 43 victims. Furthermore, the lawyer reduced the number of victims to 1, Mr. Andrews, at trial. The court sentenced the woman to death anyways. Amy's insanity was later proven, and the perpetrator's daughter confirmed that the woman was addicted to morphine. She was eventually transferred to a psychiatric hospital where she died in 1962. Money is the next motive. Gavin made a mental note and began to reflect on what he had read. Mental illness again, though the perpetrator could have just faked the illness to avoid the death penalty, and the daughter was playing along. Either way, there is already a pattern emerging. The next heroine, Nanny Doss, has been nicknamed Lonely Hearts Killer and Giggling Granny, which nicely reveals the sad story of a woman turned ruthless criminal. Nanny hated her father from childhood, who was overly strict and often overstepped his boundaries. He restricted her education, forbade her to wear makeup, and emphasized her femininity with clothes. From a young age, Nanny suffered the effects of a head injury. At the age of 7, she hit her head on a metal pole during a train journey, after which she was plagued by headaches, unconsciousness, and chronic depression for a long time. At 15, Nanny was married without her consent. She was so unhappy in her marriage that she began to drink and smoke. Stress and bad habits broke her and drove her to her first murders. The girl sent arsenic to her own 2 daughters. Nanny later divorced and became addicted to finding love in newspaper Lonely Hearts columns. Often the clients of the columns were drunks, troublemakers, and rapists. Nanny was married 5 times and killed 4 men she found through the newspaper ads. The 5th husband turned out to be a survivor. The criminal made a mistake, and after a complete recuperation of her husband, she poisoned him again, this time successfully. This had already aroused suspicion, and an autopsy revealed a lethal dose of arsenic. After her arrest, she immediately confessed to the murders. She's accounted for 11 deaths, 4 husbands, 2 children, a mother, a sister, 2 grandchildren, and a mother-in-law. The criminal killed not only for revenge, but also for insurance benefits. The good-natured looking woman didn't arouse anyone's suspicions. Nanny Doss received a life sentence in 1955. 4th on the list was Dorothea Puente. She had a tough childhood and was repeatedly subjected to pressure from her parents. After their death, Dorothea and her siblings were sent to an orphanage. The girl was often sexually abused there. The abuse turned the woman into a monster. It all started with a scam when Dorothea began trying on other people's identities and was soon arrested for 90 days of illegally running a brothel. It was during this period doctors diagnosed her as a pathological liar. She could no longer be honest with people, even if she wanted to be. Dorothea began renting out rooms in her house. Her victims were infirmed or sick people. She used medication or poison and took all the insurance checks from the victims after death. No one would think that a sweet, frail old lady was doing it. The perpetrator was only suspected when one of her tenants was reported missing. Dorothea has 9 confirmed and 6 unconfirmed murders. She denied guilt but was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1988. Once again, it was a case of mental illness. These women were not driven by brutality, but by some unknown, incomprehensible force to Gavin. I should have read on and worked it out. Next up was the case of Myra Hindley, born in 1942. The girl's life was turned upside down at 15 when a close friend of hers drowned. She soon met Ian Brady, who instilled a commitment to Nazism and guns. Myra agrees to help Ian rape minors to prove her sincere loyalty and love. The sinister couple photographed the victims and recorded their screams on tape. Afterwards, they hid the bodies in a swampy area. The maniacs have 5 murdered children to their credit. Myra was turned into the police by her cousin. He claims there were many more bodies. The killers received a life sentence. It was the first life sentence for a woman in Britain. The next killer, Beverly Ollett, was nicknamed the Angel of Death. She was a nurse on the children's ward. In 1991, the hospital began a string of deaths. It was only by happy coincidence that the staff noticed that all the deaths coincided with Beverly's work schedule. 2 of the women's young wards died from an overdose of insulin, and another died from an air bubble in a vein. After a trial, the court charged Beverly Ollett with 4 murders and 11 counts of attempted murder with grievous bodily harm. On 28 May 1993, Beverly received 13 life sentences and served them in a psychiatric hospital, where she was sent after refusing food and water. She challenged this decision repeatedly, and she was returned to prison. The police have concluded that Beverly had no mental illness, and her motives for the murders are unknown. Rosemary West became the 2nd woman in Britain to receive a life sentence after Myra Hindley. Along with her husband Fred, she was charged with 10 murders and repeated child abuse. Once again, mental illness was implicated in the case. Rosemary had an abnormal physical attraction to both sexes. While married, Rose engaged in prostitution in her own home, and her husband helped her find clients. Over time, her character also became violent. The couple abused and murdered 9 young girls. They also massacred their stepdaughter. The criminal gave birth to 8 children, 3 of whom were conceived by clients. She constantly physically abused them. After his arrest, Fred committed suicide in prison without awaiting trial, and Rosemary was sentenced to life imprisonment. Judy Buonanno is an American serial killer sentenced to death for killing her husband, a paralyzed son, and attempted murder. Judy did it for the checkbook scam. As in many previous cases, Judy was abused as a child by her parents. She was executed in the electric chair in 1998. Kristen Gilbert worked as a nurse at a veterans hospital. In 1996, her fellow nurses became concerned about the number of deaths during Kristen's shifts. Men were dying of cardiac arrest, though Kristen tried to resuscitate them. They jokingly called her the angel of death for that, and they were right. The perpetrator injected her patients with adrenaline to induce cardiac arrest. She'd wait a while and signal a problem, then try to resuscitate the dying man. She soon left the hospital and underwent repeated psychiatric treatment. A trial led the police to Gilbert's trial. The trial was able to confirm 4 murders, but it is believed the woman may have been involved in 350 deaths. The main motive was her violent temper and mental illness, which doctors discovered too late. Instead of the death penalty, she received a life sentence. The last case was Juana Barrazas, the old lady killer. As a child, Juana was sold by her alcoholic mother to a man for 3 bottles of beer. It broke Juana and changed her life forever. Juana became a professional mask wrestler, but this did not help her overcome her inner anger and resentment. Out of revenge against her mother, Juana began murdering and robbing elderly women. In 2008, she was charged with 40 counts of murder, but only 16 could be confirmed. Juana received a 759-year sentence. After reading these cases, Gavin finally realized who he was looking for. Comparing similar motives, he realized it wasn't just the killer. The perpetrator was lost in a lie, like Dorothea Puente, and brutally broken from childhood, like Nanny Doss. Without wasting any more time, the detective set out to find her. What female serial killers do you know? Write your answers in the comments, like and share this video with your friends.